So I hope you followed that, because it's extremely significant, the difference between Schiller and Goethe, and why Schiller's work is so important for today. And I have to say, there's various things of Schiller that have been going around in my head. One, first of all, I'll just say, I think that everybody is profoundly anguished by what is happening in Gaza, and not more so because for those of us who live in the United States, we know that our government could put a stop to the slaughter in 5 seconds, but it's not. And it's at such an extreme, and this is why I'm hopeful, and this is why we have to rapidly educate, elevate the approach to this crisis. If you look at what's happening in the institutions, Josh Paul's resignation in the State Department and his admission that there are probably thousands of people in the State Department who vehemently oppose the policy, the walkout in Washington of the congressional staffers who say we are fielding thousands of phone calls from the American people who want this to stop, who want a ceasefire, who want the bloodletting to stop, and the congressmen who are supposed to be representing the people who are calling their offices are not responding. They're continuing with the mantra of whatever, and you heard perhaps the most obscenely in the Republican debate, oh, we should make Gaza a parking lot. And I don't know where people think that this ends if you continue that, but the fact that you have this kind of resistance, when I participated in the Rage Against the War Machine rally in Washington, D.C., that was the largest anti-war demonstration since the Iraq War, and it was perhaps 3,500 people. We had last Saturday in Washington, I don't know, somewhere between 100 and 300,000 people. So there is a shift, but the question is, suppose we stopped the slaughter tomorrow, then what? And how do you create the conditions that mankind grows up and stops using war as a method of resolving disagreements? Because I have very clearly in my mind's eye a time when human beings, provided we survive, there's no wood to knock on right here, provided we don't annihilate ourselves, people will look back on the idea that you did physical harm to another human being and they'll say, oh, it was like the cavemen, what a bunch of barbarians, who would ever have thought that human beings would conduct themselves in such a way? So I keep thinking of the Ode to Joy, Friedrich Schiller's poem, which Beethoven set in the Ninth Symphony, and not merely the Alle Menschen werden Brüder, and forgive my German pronunciation, all men become brethren, all men become brothers, but the idea that Schiller expresses that in the heaven must a loving Father dwell. And I think this is really a challenge. When I was growing up, there was a minister. I used to, besides going to Quaker meeting, my family loved music, and I sang in the Congregational Church choir, and being a small town of 3,000 people, everybody knew everybody, and the minister was the father of my best friend in school. And he and his wife had moved to Bar Harbor from South Africa. And this must have been in the must have been late 1970s. I don't know myself what was happening in South Africa at the time, but whatever it was, he was really upset about it, and he resigned from the church. He said, I can't pastor this church anymore because I've concluded that God must not exist. That God can't exist if this kind of horror is unfolding in the world. Now that shows a very profound lack of understanding of what God is and the relationship of human beings to God. So that being said, as kind of a teaser, I'm going to read you just a little bit from Schiller's essay on universal history. And there's a lot here, and a lot of the meat of it I'm not going into, and we have it in this book here. And I will say, if you donate to my campaign, you can get a copy of the book. So it's they're in the back. But there's a lot in here. Lainey, who is going to be speaking after me, will go through another element of it. The whole first section I'm not touching, which is the difference between the bread-fed scholar, that is someone who just learns to go through the motions, get a job, and they get completely enraged when anyone ever discovers something new because it overturns what they learned. I'm sure none of you know anyone like that. And then there's the philosophical mind that loves new ideas, that's always seeking to make a harmony of the whole. And Schiller said, I went through this in my lecture, which, by the way, this lecture, and this is important, was May 26th or 27th in 1789. It was before the storming of the Bastille, which occurred in July. And I say that because I don't know if it had been written after that, if it would have been quite as optimistic. I just don't know. Maybe it would have been. He was right. But anyway, just listen to this arc. He writes, the discoveries which our European mariners have made in distant oceans and on remote coastlines present us a spectacle as constructive as it is entertaining. They show us tribes which surround us at the most diverse levels of culture, like children of different ages gathered around an adult, reminding him by their example of what he used to be and where he started from. A wise hand seems to have preserved these raw tribes for us down to our times, where we would be advanced enough in our own culture to make fruitful application of this discovery upon ourselves, and to restore out of this mirror the forgotten origin of our species. But how shaming and sad is the picture these people give us of our childhood. And yet the level at which we see them is not even the first. Mankind began even more contemptuously. Those we study today we already find as nations, as political bodies, but mankind first had to elevate itself by an extraordinary effort to political society. Now, what do these travelers tell us about these savages? They found some without any knowledge of the most indispensable skills, without iron, without the plow, some even without possession of fire. Some still wrestled with wild beasts for food and dwelling. Among many, language had scarcely been elevated from animal sounds to understandable signs. A little bit like some people speak today, but in some places, there was not even the simple bond of marriage. As yet, no knowledge of property, and in others, the flaccid soul was not even able to retain an experience which repeats itself every day. One saw the savage carelessly relinquish the bed on which he slept because it did not occur to him that he would sleep again tomorrow. War, however, was with them all, and the flesh of the vanquished enemy was not seldom the prize of victory. Among others, acquainted with various leisures of life, who had already achieved a higher level of culture, slavery and despotism presented us a dreadful picture of them. Once we find a tyrant in Africa, trading his subjects for a gulp of brandy. Another time they would be slaughtered on his grave to serve him in the underworld. Where once pious simplicity prostrates itself to a ridiculous fetish, another time it is to a terrible monster. Mankind portrays himself in his gods. Where over there we see denigrating slavery, stupidity, superstition bow him down, yet another time we see him utterly miserable on the other extreme of lawless freedom, always armed for attack and defense. Startled by every noise, the savage strains his cautious ear into the desert. Everything new is the enemy. And woe to the stranger whom a storm has cast upon the coast. No hospital hearth will smoke for him, no sweet hospitality comfort him. But even where mankind has elevated itself from hostile solitude to community, from privation to luxury, from fear to joy, how bizarre and atrocious he seems to our eyes. His crude taste seeks joy in stupor, beauty in distortion, glory in exaggeration. Even his virtue awakens horror in us, and what he calls his bliss can only arouse our disgust and pity. So were we. Caesar and Tacitus found us not much better 1,800 years ago. Where are we now? Let me linger for a moment at this epoch in which we are now living, at this present shape of the world we inhabit. Human diligence has cultivated it and subdued the resting land through persistence and skill. In one part of the world, we see that mankind redeemed the land from the sea. Somewhere else, he opened rivers onto the arid land. Mankind has intermingled the regions and the seasons and has toughened the weak plants of the Orient to his own harsh climate. As he brought Europe to the West Indies and the South Seas, so he also let Asia arise in Europe. A merrier sky now laughs above Germany's forests, which the powerful hand of man tore open to the rays of sunshine, and in the waves of the Rhine are mirrored Asia's grapevines. Populous towns rise on its banks, which swarm with vigorous life of pleasure and work. Here we find a man secure in peaceful possession of his acquisitions, among millions of others whom previously a single neighbor had robbed of his slumbers. The equality he lost upon entering community, he regained through wise laws. He escaped from the blind constraint of pure chance and poverty under the more gentle constraint of treaties, and surrendered the liberty of the beast of prey to redeem the more noble freedom of the human being. Prevailing need compels him no longer to the plowshare. No enemy any longer demands of him that he leave his plow to defend home and fatherland on the battlefield. How many creations of art, how many wonders of diligence, what light in all fields of knowledge, since man no longer consumes his energies in pitiful self-defense, since it has been placed at his discretion to reconcile himself with need, which he ought never fully to escape, since he has obtained the valuable privilege to command freely over his capabilities and follow the call of his genius. What lively activity everywhere, since desires multiplied lent new wings to inventive genius and opened new spheres to his diligence. The boundaries are breached, which isolated states and nations in hostile egoism. All thinking minds are now bound together by the bond of world citizenry, and all the light of the century can now illuminate the spirit of a new Galileo and Erasmus. Since the time when the laws descended to the weakness of man, too accommodated to the laws, with them he has become gentle. Just as he ran wild when they were wild, barbaric crimes follow their barbaric punishment gradually into oblivion. A great step toward ennoblement has taken place so that the laws are virtuous, although mankind still is not. Where duties enforced upon mankind are relaxed, morality takes command of him, whom no punishment terrifies, and no conscience curbs, is now held within bounds by laws of decency and honor. So Schiller is sort of taking this huge arc from complete barbarism to, in effect, describing a Renaissance period where mankind has transformed himself. And then he goes on to discuss, and he also talks about at the beginning, human history. How did we each come to be here? And how did we each come to be the person that we are? And how did our society develop? And how many different threads have contributed to that? And how can you be confident that this will develop? For example, the period that we're in today, where we see such barbarism, it's not uniform. About 2/3 of the world's population is going in a completely other direction with the Belt and Road Initiative, with the BRICS process, with the programs that Lyndon LaRouche fought for 50 years ago. So what determines which way it goes? Is it just faith? Is it divine intervention? Is it will? And I think some people might be familiar with the writings of Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, who was a very crucial thinker and had a great deal to do with the founding of the United States. And he describes in various essays and in the Theodicy the question of the best of all possible worlds, because it was a raging debate where people said, well, if God is perfect, then can God do evil? And if evil exists in the world, does that mean that God wills for things to be evil? Because if God wanted something evil to be done, wouldn't that mean that God was less than perfect? And so how do you reconcile this problem? Leibniz talks about the question of lazy reason, where he says that some men and even Christians introduce into their dealings some mixture of fate, of stoic fate, where you say, well, I don't have to do anything, it's all ordained by God. Everyone's run into this, right? I just say these magic words and you'll be raptured or whatever. So he says, but if you watch them, you will see that they will not fail to run out of the house if it's collapsing, right? Or if they see a treasure buried in the ground, they don't sit there and say, well, I'm going to wait for God to give me the treasure, right? They'll go dig it up. So clearly people don't exactly believe this, but he uses this example, which is very funny. He said, if someone's unhealthy and you say, look, if you really want to be healthy, you should change your diet. And they say, oh no, I'm going to just keep eating whatever. But then they get sick. And so then every kind of food has a mystical, obsessive, magical quality, right? So you see this sort of yin-yang between, everything, I can do whatever I want, or it's out of my control, God will take care of it. He calls that lazy reason. And it actually brings me to a joke, and I'm going to conclude with that. And then we will go to the chorus, and then we will go to Lainey. But it's just worth thinking about, because somewhere in here is this question about what is it going to take to get from here to a Renaissance, to get from here to where mankind grows up. And where is the limit between you've done everything you can and it works, and do you have to use reason all the time? So some of you may know about this. I think it happened in Louisiana during Katrina when there was the flood, and a man prayed to God to save him, and he knew that God would save him, and the waters were coming up, and his neighbor came by in a rowboat and said, get in the boat. And the man said, no, I'm fine, God's going to save me. So the water comes up to the second floor, and another friend comes by in a motorboat and says, come on, get out, the water's rising, get in the boat. And the man said, no, I'm not worried, God's going to save me. So then the water comes all the way up to the roof of the house, there's just the ridge, he's standing there, a helicopter flies over him, a rope comes down, they say, get on the helicopter, grab the rope. He says, oh no, God's going to save me. So he drowns, and he gets up to heaven, and God says, what are you doing up here? And he goes, well, you said you were going to save me. And God said, are you kidding? I sent you 2 boats and a helicopter. Okay, that's good.